So this is a patient with his doctor in a modern hospital. Despite the doctor's best intentions, there's a fair chance this patient will die because of a mistake in diagnosis. In fact, some 500 people will die in the US today because of an error in diagnosis. So why do we have this problem, and how do we change it? Let's imagine an engineer in this picture. That's my engineer. I'm going to convince you over the next 15 minutes how getting an engineer into the picture of medical diagnostics can help doctors save a lot more lives. So that's the title of my talk. So let's say you get sick, we all do, and you go to a doctor. What does the doctor do? Well, maybe takes your temperature, blood pressure, maybe asks you questions like, do you have a headache? Did you sleep well? And then let's say you complain about pain in the chest. Then she'll do an electrocardiogram, an EKG, maybe an echocardiogram, maybe takes a blood sample, sends it away for more tests. So what the doctor is doing is collecting data, collecting lots and lots of data. Then she takes this data and then uses her knowledge and her experience and her learning, and then also the guidelines that have been established by the field, which represent the medical community's knowledge and experience, and attempts to fit this pattern into a disease model. And if it fits it well enough, in her opinion, then she pronounces a diagnosis. So what she's doing is taking her data, adding knowledge to it, and making an inference leading to a diagnosis. To simplify this problem, let's say there are only two variables you're looking at, something like heart rate and blood pressure, which most of us are familiar with. So this picture shows you how there would be a range of values where you would say it's healthy, maybe a range of values where you are sick. So she attempts to put you into this, or classify you into these two bins of sick and healthy. This is a problem that we engineers call pattern recognition. And we've done this for a long time. Okay? So, is there really a problem with diagnostics? Yes, there's very much a problem. In fact, the numbers are difficult to come by. But from what data we can gather, we know that there are at least 40,000 medical mistakes that are lethal or very harmful that happen every day in the US. Of all the possible medical mistakes that can happen, diagnostic errors are the most costly, most common, and most dangerous. How you're diagnosed is very critical to how you're treated. So it's a life and death situation. Okay? What are the consequences of a wrong diagnosis? Well, there are two. The first is a failure, or a delay at least, to treat a real condition, leading to increased sickness, or worse. The second possible consequence is that you do get treated for a treatment for a disease or a condition that you don't have. In fact, there is an enormous number of unnecessary treatments and surgeries that happen today. It's estimated that about 20% of pacemakers, maybe about 30-40% of knee replacements, about a third of hysterectomies, and about half of cesareans are actually unnecessarily performed in the US. Okay? So, why does this happen? So, in my opinion, there are at least three reasons why diagnostics is a very, very difficult problem, and why there are so many mistakes. The first is that the human body is a very, very complex, dynamic system. with a lot of phenomena that happen all the time in the body. So there are a lot of phenomena that happen in the body at the same time, which we don't really know and probably will not know for many decades to come. So how complex is the human body? Don't try to read this. I'm just trying to overwhelm you, and I hope I succeeded. So this is just a picture of just a few of the complex mechanisms that happen in the body all the time. Okay? And imagine the doctor's position who has to deal with this and be able to make a diagnosis. The second problem is that you and I and everybody sitting next to you, everybody is different. We are all different. The same set of parameters or conditions that causes a problem in me may do nothing to you. In other words, there is a confounding amount of diversity amongst us. The third problem, I'm sure you'll be glad to know, I was, nobody is perfect, which gives me a license to fudge my lines a little here. So nobody is perfect. So what do I mean by this? Suppose you have a little bit of elevated body temperature or maybe a little bit of arrhythmia or irregularity in your heartbeat, doesn't mean you rush to surgery, right? So in other words, it's very difficult to define what's normal and what's not normal for a lot of physical parameters. Okay? So these are the sort of the three main reasons why diagnostics is a hard problem. And this is where engineers come in. Engineers have at least two areas of expertise that is relevant to this problem. The first, I'm sure you know this, engineers love data. They love looking at numbers, they love looking at data. Engineers have been looking at data for a long time. Okay, it's what makes them boring, right? So recall that medical diagnosis is all about looking at data and making a judgment or an inference out of this data. Well, engineers have done exactly that, looking at very sophisticated systems and looking at data and making a judgment. Okay? That's one. The second thing is that engineers know how to apply science. Engineering is really application of science. Okay? And granted, the science that engineers use is for what we call engineering systems, but it turns out that the human body, regardless of the philosophical mysteries of life and death, is still physical matter, and all its itsy-bitsy parts still obey the laws of science, namely physics and chemistry. And engineers can apply the same science to the anatomy and for human beings. Okay? Again, I'm going to show another slide, very busy slide. Don't try to read this, even if you do understand the equations there. This looks like nonsense and gobbledygook, but what it is really real physics, real math applied to real parts of the human anatomy that actually works. Okay? So my point is that engineers can use this data and physics and bring them over to medicine for the express purpose of diagnostics. So in our own research, we've used both of them, and we've done a lot of different problems. And I want to talk about one particular example, and it's a problem called periventricular leukomalacia. And like all medical words, it's a mouthful. They invent the vocabulary to keep us out. We all know that. So we call it PVL, okay? Which is a good term for it, okay? It affects neonates with cardiac defects to a fairly high degree of incidence, but also affects all preterm babies to maybe about 10%. And it's a kind of a neurological damage that happens, and there is no cure, and its etiology or what causes it is really not well known. And the consequence on the impact on the individual is lifelong with neurological issues, as you might imagine. Currently, the way they diagnose this is there's an actual picture of an MRI being done on a patient to detect PVL in Children's Hospital. So they do an MRI, they look at the image, and they look to see if there is PVL, and if there is, they try to measure the extent of the damage, and then they pronounce the diagnosis. They say, okay, this kid has PVL, now we go about treating it. And say treating it, I mean treating the symptoms that result from the disease. Our idea is to get in and use all the data they collect and try to calculate some kind of leading indicators so we can tell the doctors that PVL is likely to occur so they can intervene to either prevent it from happening or perhaps prevent it from getting worse. And they collect a lot of data. They collect data such as blood gas data, lots of concentrations of the gases in the blood, what are called vital sign data, which means the heart rate, blood pressure, all kinds of stuff. Okay? So that's our objective in this research. So before I go into what we do, I want to talk about two concepts that will shed some light on our approach. The first is the concept of timescales. It turns out that the human body has a lot of dynamic phenomena that happen at the same time, okay? But they're all happening at different timescales. So this picture that I'm showing actually shows something that you're probably familiar with, the bone mass density in the typical human body that changes over years. So we all know that as we get older, we lose our bone mass, right? But this happens over years. And as a personal example, I can talk about my hair that I've been losing over a period of years. Thank God for that, right? But then there are other kinds of phenomena, such as hormones, that maybe half the humanity is very aware of, that tends to vary over a period of days. And then there is glucose cycles, which happen, which is the reason we get hungry, for example, happens over hours. And then things like neuronal impulses and cellular phenomena, for example, can happen over seconds or milliseconds. So there's all these phenomena that are happening at over different timescales. And so we got to thinking about PVL, the neurological damage, and said, so how do we find out what's going on? And we wanted to look at the timescales and use that as an application for this particular problem. So we said, can we identify certain things that are happening at different timescales and link it causally, in some causal fashion, to the occurrence of PVL? And the neurologist we were working with suggested that we look at 2 hours, 20 minutes, and 1 minute timescales based on his experience working with this problem. He's one of the leading experts in the country working on this problem. And he says, let's look at these particular timescales. So we looked at that. And here is a graph to that, dealing with that calculation. So this is a complicated mathematical process. I don't want to go into the details. I'm sure you'll be happy to hear that. And it's called continuous wavelet transforms. But we're looking at the heart rate variability over 20 minutes, and we're doing this what's called a continuous wavelet transform. And it shows you, even visually, you can see that the healthy and sick are different, right? And of course, we crunch numbers to figure this out. The second concept that we used, I'll come back to this in a second. The second concept we use is shown in this figure, and this shows the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the bloodstream plotted over time. Okay? Now, like all physiological variables, there is a range of acceptable values. It cannot exceed a certain value, it cannot go below a certain value. And of course, like all physiological variables, they do so. They do go over, they do come under. So we postulated that it's not that important that it goes up or down. What's important is how much it goes up or down and how long it stays in this out-of-range area. So we came up with an index that we call an out-of-range index that's shown by this blue patch. And guess what? This turned out to be one of the most important predictors for PVL. And this is a new finding because nobody knows why it's caused. So we use concepts like these to develop our system. So I want to kind of summarize what I said so far in terms of 2 points. One point is that it's really impossible to look at some physiological variable that's being measured on a monitor and make an inference that this is going to cause a certain problem. It's not possible for a human being. And it's not possible for the smartest human beings. So you may have the smartest physicians, but they're still human beings. You need mathematical processing to uncover a hidden pattern that lies underneath. That's my first point. The second point, you cannot just throw data into a computer and expect it to work. You need physicians. You need physicians with their insight, their knowledge, and their experience to really guide these algorithms, like they did with the timescales, to help you get the best answer. So what do we do with all this? So we use all this math and physics and concepts called machine learning. You might have heard of it as AI, artificial intelligence. We also use a physician input, and we develop what we call a clinical decision support system. The key operative word here is support, because we're not trying to replace the physician. What we're trying to do is develop a set of indicators and a support system in order that the clinical physician can make a decision using this information. So this is a support system. So given that, knowing that PVL is a continuing research problem we're still working on, where are we with this? Recall that the current procedure is to do an MRI, look at the image, and say, oops, PVL has happened for this child. We're going to have to deal with this. That's the current procedure. What we are doing is collecting the data as soon as surgery happens, and using that data, we carry out our mathematical processing, and then we indicate if PVL is going to happen after a few hours of collecting the data. Okay? So our current results are that we can predict with about 85% certainty after 6 hours of monitoring that either a child is going to have PVL or not going to have PVL. Oh, wow. And the idea is that the doctors can get in at that point and do whatever magic they do to deal with the treatment. Okay? So, what's the takeaway from this, from this talk? The first is that, and I cannot emphasize this enough, medical diagnostics is a societal problem. It affects you, affects me, it affects our families, it affects our friends, our neighbors, our communities, our societies, our country, everybody. Sooner or later, every one of us needs this, and we need this to be accurate. As practiced today, it's not acceptable. It's not acceptably accurate. We can do better. It needs help. Pure data science is not enough. What I mean by this is we cannot just take all of this data we are collecting, the big data, so to speak, and throw it into a computer and say, go fish for a pattern and come back and tell me what's going on. We need intelligent input. We need experience. We need intuition. We need physician input. We need engineers guiding the algorithms. Engineers have two different areas of expertise I talked about. One is data analysis, and second is application of physics and math. And they can use this, and they should help with the medical diagnostics. I strongly believe that engineers and engineering scientists can use their skills to not only help with diagnosis, but also help deepen our understanding of this very complex phenomena, complex mechanisms that you and I are hiding in our ordinary-looking bodies. We are very sophisticated machines. Lastly, this is a cooperative, collaborative effort. We have to have engineers working with doctors in order to create a diagnostic system that works. Imagine a team, such a team, working together that would save at least a few of those 500 lives that would be lost today because of a mistake in diagnosis. Thank you very much.